the appropriateness of being Isaac in the sugyas of HSukkah during Chodesh Elul is not just because we shortly will be Shloshim Yom Koydem Chag HaSukkos, because as we know, there is a broad discussion in the Rishonim. Yosef brings it Barichas in the beginning of Hilchas Pesach. If Sukkos has a din of being Isaac in Hilchas of the Regel, Shloshim Yom Koydem HaSukkah, so that din is only said by Pesach. Discussion is based on the thesis in a number of places. Miyuchad for Pesach because Yeshlach Halachas Merubos, because it has to be made from the carbon Pesach, and if it's said by other Moyadim. There's a particular connection between the Inyanim of Sukkos and Elul, and that is based on the Sugya in Erchin, Soif Erchin, Daflam Beis Beis, where the Gemara says that when Klal Yisrael returned from Golus Bovel, Klal Yisrael was once again Mekayim the mitzvah of Sukkah. And the Gemara says, V'chi David HaMelech lo osa Sukkos. Throughout Bayis Rishon, were they not Mekayim the mitzvah of Sukkah? And the Gemara says, Elo, that they were mispalled to be mevatel the Yetzer Davei the Zora. Va'agin alayhu ki Sukkah. Klal Yisrael received a shmira, a madrega, as a result of the bittul of the Yetzer Avodah Zarah, which is compared in the Novi to having been Mekayim mitzvah Sukkah, the agin alayhu ki Sukkah. Sukkah means that we're being Yeshiv B'tzila de Memenuso. It's a kurva to Shechina Akdosha. And every degree of removal of the impact that the Yetzer has on us, the Gemara says in Erchin, is Agin Alayu Ki Sukkah, is comparable to a Sukkah. As we'll see Be'ez Hashem in the Divir Haggadah Bli Neder, at the end of the Limud, Chodesh Elul is meyuchad as a Chodesh in which we can release ourselves somewhat. We can extricate ourselves somewhat from the impact, the hold that the Yetzer has on us. As the Gemara says, being released from the impact of the Yetzer is Agin Alayu Ki Sukkah. So it's appropriate that at the beginning of Chodesh Elul, we should immediately start being Isaac in the sugyas of Sukkah. We'll begin Be'ezer Hashem with the Mishnah on Daf Chav Ches Amud Beis. Steht in Mishnah, Kol Shivas Hayomim Odom Oise Sukkosoi Keva Ubeisoi Arai. That through all the Shivas Yom of Sukkos, a person makes a Sukkah, Keva, and his bayis Arai. Now, this is not describing the structure of the Sukkah. We know from the Sugyas in the beginning of the first parak of Sukkah as a machloikis if Sukkah is diras Arai Bo'inon or diras Kva Bo'inon. Machloikis Tanoim. Here we're speaking about when the Mishnah says Odom Oises Sukkosoi Keva, it means the dira in his Sukkah during the Shivas Yomim should be his dira Kvua. And the dira that he is in his bias is a dira of Arai. In this limud, we won't have a chance to discuss so much the second part of the memory of the Mishnah of what Beisoi Arai is Mechayiv. What's Mechayiv? What does dira in Beisoi Arai mean? We'll see Shitas Rishonim, Bahag, and the Geoinim that the Ritz Geos brings, that a person has to be memayet in the shimush of his bias during Shiva Simei HaSukkos, and Be'ez Hashem will see that in a further limud. The limud today, Bli Neder, will focus be'ikr on what the mechayev of Odom Oise Sukkosei Kva. The Gemara elaborates, Tanu Rabbanon Kol Shiva Sayomim Odom Oise Sukkosei Kva Ubeisei Arai Keitzad. How does a person create that the dira in his sukkah should be a dira of keva? There's a din to take one's kelim noim and one's matzois nois into the sukkah. Oichel v'shoise u'metayel basukah. Says the Gemara, Minoani Milei, the Tanu Rabbanon teishvu ke'in toduru mikan omru kol shiva sayomim Odom Oise Sukkosei Keva Ubeisei Arai, and the Bride says, Keitzad, Hoyle Kelim Noe Mal Masukkah, Matzois Noes Mal Masukkah, Oichel Veshoise Umatayel Basukkah, Umeshanen Basukkah. Meshanen is lim. the Rambam brings this brisa as a din. The Rambam in Perek Vov of HSukkah, halacha hey, the Rambam says, Keitzad hi MITZVAS HaYeshiva BaSukkah. How is a person mekayim MITZVAS yeshiva? Zot the Rambam shea oichel v'shoise v'dor BaSukkah kol shivas hayomim bein bayoim bein balayla kederech shush dor bebeisai.
Excuse me, could you put the Rambam on, please?
V'kol shivas hayomim odom oise es beisoi arai v'sukosei kva shenemar BaSukkahs teishu shivas yomim keitzad kelim hanoim u'matzois hanois BaSukkah. So if we medayek carefully in the Seder Hadvarim of the Rambam has told us two dinim. There's a din that a person has to make his sukkah keva and his bayis arai. His sukkah has to be his ikr mokum dira. How does a person make his bayis arai and his sukkah keva? That's the second part of the Rambam in halacha hey, that he takes the kelim and matzois nois, which ordinarily would be adorning his bayis, and he places them in the sukkah. And adarabo, klei shtio kagoin ashishois v'koisois, abba sukkah, aval klei achila kagoin keder sukkah orois, remain chutz la sukkah. Which means by placing his matzois nois, etc., in the sukkah, he has shown that the ikr mokum, the ikr mailas habayis, is the sukkah, and adarava in the bayis is where he has the kli bishul. That establishes the din of oise sukkose keva uveise harai. That now the Rambam now says, and now we come to the beginning of halacha hey. Once the sukkah has been established as his mokum kavua, he has made his bayis arai and his sukkose keva. How then is he dor in that mokum kavua? Zot the Rambam, Keitzad hi ha-mitzvos ha-yeshiva basukkah, shea oichel v'shoise v'dor basukkah, kol shivas hayomim. So seemingly the Rambam has told us two halachas. There's one halacha to establish that the bayis is kavua, and the bayis is arai, and the sukkah is keva. That's done by transferring matzois nois and kelim noim from one to the other. And now the mokum for the kelim noim is in the sukkah. Once the sukkah has been established as the mokum dira for those shiva yomim, there's the Rambam Keitzad mitzvah shiva basukkah she oichel v'shoise v'dor basukkah. That's how we would understand what the Rambam is establishing in halacha hey. Let's now continue to halacha vav. Oichlin v'shoisim u'yeshenim basukkah kol shiva bein bayoim bein balayla. V'osa lechol suda chutz lasukkah kol shiva ve'en yeshenim chutz lasukkah. What's the Rambam adding in halacha vav that he hasn't said in halacha hey? Halacha vav starts, Keitzad mitzvos hayeshiva shea oichel v'shoise v'dor basukkah kol shivas hayomim bein bayoim bein balayla. Now the Rambam in halacha vav starts again, oichlin v'shoisim yeshenim basukkah kol shiva bein bayoim bein balayla, which seems to be an exact repeat of the first line in halacha hey. V'asa lechol suda chutz lasukkah, asa lishon chutz lasukkah. What has the Rambam added in halacha vav that the Rambam hasn't said in halacha hey? Certainly the beginning of halacha vav seems to be identical to the beginning of halacha hey. Secondly, a pliya tsuma that the Rambam in halacha hey, and be'etzem it's the brisa, it's not the Rambam, doesn't mention in the description of Keitzad mitzvos hayeshiva basukkah that one is yoshen basukkah. Steht in Rambam, Keitzad mitzvos hayeshiva basukkah, shea oichel v'shoise v'dor basukkah kol shivas yomim. No mention of Sheina. In halacha vav, the Rambam says, oichlim v'shoisim v'yeshenim basukkah. Sheina is missing in halacha hey, but is mentioned in halacha vav. On the other hand, in halacha hey, the Rambam has a vague and general term called dor basukkah, kol shiva yomim, which Rambam doesn't mention in halacha vav. The kasha is not really on the Rambam. The kasha is actually on the brisa. The brisa says, Tonu Rabbanon kol shiva sayomim odom oise sukkose beis harai keitzad, and the Rambam says, the brisa says, oichel v'shoise u'metayel basukkah. The brisa doesn't mention sheina. So the Rambam in halacha hey copied the brisa from Daf Chav Ches, and in halacha vav added sheina, which the brisa doesn't mention. Moreover, in halacha vav, the Rambam has added something which he doesn't mention b'chlal in halacha hey. In Halacha Vav, the Rambam speaks about an Isser. Osa le'echol suda chutz la'sukkah. Ve'ein yishenim chutz la'sukkah. Be'ez Hashem, in a further limud, will come back, B'lineda, to define more precisely what the Lashon Osir means. Is it an actual Isser or just being mevatel an essay? But the Rambam in Halacha Hey, when the Rambam defines the Gedorim of Mitzvahs HaYeshiva, the Rambam doesn't say V'osa le'echol chutz la'sukkah. Whereas in Halacha Vav, the Rambam does. This Gemara is not copied on the Maramakamis, but there is a Mishnah in Lulav HaRav, Mishnah on Daf Mem Ches Amud Aleph. We're familiar that Perek Lulav HaRav begins with a list of mitzvahs which were Mekayim on Chag HaSukkos. Lulav HaRav Shisha, V'Shiva, Halal V'Simcha Shmoina. One of the mitzvahs is V'Sukkah Shiva. One's Mekayim mitzvah Sukkah Shivas Yom. So the Mishnah on Daf Ches Amud Beis explains, the mitzvah of Shiva, Sukkah's Neig Shiva is Pasuk Mefurish. Sukkah's Teishu Shivas Yom. What's the Mishnah saying? Zog the Mishnah, Sukkah Shiva Keitzad, Goma Milechel. Person finishes his Suda on the last day of Sukkot, what we call Hoshana Rabbah, Lo Yatir Es Sukkasai. He shouldn't take down his Sukkah. He shouldn't dismantle his Sukkah. Aval Moir the Sakelim in a Mincha Lamalam, and he covered Yontav Achron Shulchan. HaRav, the Mishnah of Chof Ches said that the din of the Sukkah is that the Sukkah should contain the Kelim Noim, which ordinarily he would have the Beisai. So Mipnei covered of Yontav Achron, in Eretz Yisrael, Yontav Achron, we're back in the Bayis. Mamela, Zot the Mishnah, Mina Mincho Lamala, you can bring the Kalim back. Rashi often says, Vashteit in the Mishnah, why shouldn't you undo your Sukkah? And what's the Chiddush that you can take the Kalim down? Mipnei Kovad Yontav. Zot Rashi, Dibra Maschol Yatir Sukkasoi, Zot Rashi, the Hokola Yoim, Choivasa Lishen Uleshanin. The whole day is a chiyuv that if you want to sleep or you want to learn, you should learn in the sukkah. And so too, if you'd want to eat again, you would need your sukkah. So Rashi says, Lo Yatir seems to be an Eitz HaToiva, which means you might need your sukkah. Don't rush to take it down just because you finished the Suda. You may want to be Yoshin, you may want to learn, you may want to eat again. Hold the sukkah. The Chiddush of the Mishnah, Rashi says at the end, Mipnei Kovad Yontav, Shemarish Kemeichin Atzma Likrose L'Mokum She'Yisad Sham Kala Laila. Towards the Seif Hayom, you can show Kovad Yontav by taking the Kalim down. Rashi doesn't say what the Chiddush in that is. So the Ran, on this Mishnah, the Ran says there's a Chiddush in the Reisha that you can't take down your Sukkah, and there's a Chiddush in the Sefer that you're allowed to take the Kalim down in Amin Chalamala. What's the Chiddush? Zok the Ran, the Lashon of the Ran is, and from Be'ez Hashem, from this Ran, we'll try and establish the Yesod of this Limud. Zok the Ran nearly the Hainu Taima. The reason why you shouldn't be Matis Sukkah, Rashi said was, don't hurry to dismantle your Sukkah because you have to be Yoshin, you might want to be Yoshin, you might want to be Shoyne, you may want to be Oichel. In Ran steht andere. The Ran says, the Hainu Taima, the Kevan, the Omer Achmana, Bas Sukkah's Teishu Shivas Yomim, since there's a Gzes HaKosov, that's Mechayev, YESHIVAS SUKKAH, V'Shiva Yomim, Tzorich Sheteheloi Sukkah Kol Shiva. There's a Dindoi Raisa that the person has to have a Sukkah for Shiva Yomim. This is a Chiddush Nifla that's Mavur in the Ran. Ordinarily, we understand that there's no din that a person has to have a sukkah prepared for him or a possibility of being oichel b'sukkah shiva yomim. Shtar din. The din is if you want to do something which is an act of dira, for example, to be oichel, to be shoyse, to be yoshein, to be shoyne, that has to be done in a sukkah because Teishvu Ke'ein Toduru says you have to be dor in a sukkah. But is there any din that Shivas Yomim one has to have a sukkah to be dorin? Shtar zadin. Memele Zok the Ran, in this Mishnah it says that one does have to have a sukkah Shivas Yomim. Omer Rachmana basukkos teishu yomim tzorich sheteheloi sukkah kol shiva. And therefore there's a din that you cannot be matir, you cannot take down the sukkah until the end of Shiva Yomim. Rashi learned the din is since you may have the need for the sukkah, don't rush to take down the sukkah. In Ran state nishtazoi. In Ran state, sukkah shiva ketzan. What does it mean, sukkah shiva? Taichiran, sukkah shiva is a din. The gzeres hakosov is basukkah's teishu shivas yom means you have to have a sukkah to be yeshivin. And therefore, Zot the Ran, the din is lo yatir sukkah. It's a din.
So if a person goes away, have to drop them back to have a sukkah, just keep it not coming back.
Do they have to have? So if they're potter from yeshiva sukkah bichlal, they may not have the din. The gzeres hakosov of having a sukkah shivas yom is learned weiter from the din of a sukkah's teishu shivas yom.
He's going to be potter on the earth before he leaves right now.
And in Chunami, he shouldn't be matir sukkah until he has the ptur, as they state in Ran. So Memela, the Ran says that's also the chiddush in the sefer. It's fair to the Ran. V'hainu diktani sefer v'murdu es akedim b'nimchaman pe'kavod yontiv k'loyma. Says the Ran l'shitosoi she'afa pishet tzorich kol shiva la asoi sukkosoi keva. HaRav, we learned in the Mishnah that included in the din of having a sukkah for Shivas Yomim is that sukkah should be his makom kavua. And we explained, and we were medayik in the Rambam, that the way in which that sukkah becomes his makom for dira kavua is adarabba where his kelim noim are in the sukkah and not in the bayis. So memela zot deran nifla, if you'll remove the kelim noim before the end of Shiva, you have then taken away from the sukkah its din kva. And the gzeres hakosov of sukkah's teishu shivas yom is mechayev zot deran sheteheloi sukkah, and that sukkah is mokum dirasa hakvua. So the din of our Mishnah on Daf Chof Ches zot deran is meikar dine and oifani kiyul mitzvah sukkah shiva is that the sukkah has to be a sukkah of kval shivas yom. Memela zot deran, it's a chiddush in the Mishnah that mina min cholamala kavod yontiv is a matir to already remove the kelim from the sukkah. What's the bir advarim? The Maisa, one doesn't have the kelim until the Sefer Shivas Yom. What's the heter? The Ran is Sosum. He says, Apal Pisha Tzarach Kol Shiva Lasa Sukkah Keva, Hoylo Kelim Noim Atzois Yontiv, Roy Shiyu Basukah Kol Shiva, Filo Hochi, Mipnei Kovad Yontiv Achron Shel Chag Rashay Lahi Rida. You should Kovad Yontiv, you're allowed to take them. They're not in the sukkah. The sukkah is no longer the Makam Keva. What's Mavur in the Ran is that since Avada, a person would sometimes take from his bias, his kelim noim, to go and be mechabed someone else. He would lend them to someone, or he would take them out to show kavod for something. So here he's removing the kelim noim to show kavod for yontif. It's not that he's reestablishing his bias. He's showing kavod for yontif. Kavod for yontif is not a stira to kavod abayis. And the mela, the sukkah remains his diras kva. But oifen that we've learned from the Rana Yisoid, that there's nichlal in mitzvah sukkah shiva two dinim. One is, and the primary din is, the din that it says in the Mishnah of Chof Ches, to have a sukkah for shivas yomim where that sukkah is the makom of his dira kvuah. Kol shivas yomim odom oises sukkosoi keva. That's a din. We haven't yet discussed bichlal the dinim of teishvu ke'ein toduru, that's mechayev you to carry out all meisim of dira in that sukkah. We're speaking about that before we are magdir. What it's mechayev, teishvu kein toduru, the basic din of sukkah is mechayev, having a sukkah for shiva, such that the sukkah is established as the mokum for one's dira kvuah for those shiva yom. And the further around that's mufurish Mishnah, sukkah shiva. The Mishnah in the beginning of Lulav Rava, Sukkah Shiva, Zot Deran, Sukkah Shiva Keitzad, Lo Yati Sukkasa. Was steht in the Mishnah? Steht Zot Deran, steht in Mishnah Adin. The Sukkah has to be established for Shiva Yom as one's Makam Dira. And that didn't precede, so to speak, now what my chiyuvim are to carry out in that Sukkah. That's a separate sugya of what's considered a Maisa Dira that then has to take place and be carried out in the Sukkah. But before the din of what is considered an active dira, one has a mitzvah to establish one's makom dira for Shivas Yomim, that should be a makom kva. And that's a mitzvah b'fnei atzmoi that sukkah is mechayiv. And Zot the Ran, that's also nilmud from the pasuk, b'sukkahs teishu Shivas Yomim. Correct. And we'll come back to many of those pratim beis Hashem. Before we come back to see the lashon of the Rambam, we'll try and establish a makor in Kama Rishonim that besides that mitzvah sukkah is mechayev dira in the sukkah in a certain way, there is a primary chiyuv to establish b'chlal mitzvah sukkah a mokum dira for shiva, which is a ikar chayva sukkah. Will be medayek a loshen nifla in the beginning of she'iltas. She'iltas in Parshas V'zos HaBracha. She'ilta kuf samach tes. Steht in she'iltas the mechayivin the Beis Yisrael. This is on the supplementary page of the Maramakom, is top right. The mechayivin Beis Yisrael lemevad metalalta. Metalalta is a sukkah. That's a paragraph of the word sukkah. Is metalalta. Metalalta means a canopy, a cover.
Yeah, we'll put up the shoulders, please.
The mechayivin the Beis Yisrael lemevad metalalta umeisav bo shiva yoimei. Steht mefurish in she'iltas. Lashon she'iltas is that there's a chiyuv to make a sukkah and then to be yoshev in it. V'imtim tzaloyman, that the lashon of the she'iltas is lav dafka, and lemeibad metalalto umeisav bo just means that a person should have a sukkah to sit in, and it's lav dafka. It's mavur in the hemshech of the she'iltas that avada the lashon is dafka. How? Because for each one of the two dinim, the she'iltas brings a separate pasuk to be medayek. Dichsiv chag hasukkos tasa lecho shivas yomim, uksiv basukkos teishvu shivas yomim. So the she'iltas has brought two psukim. The first part of the she'iltas is statement the mechayv Beis Yisrael lemev ad metalalta, to make one. The makor is dichsiv chag hasukkos tasa lecho shivas yomim. Psukim mefurashim. The she'iltas is just translating psukim. The second part of the chiyuv umeisav bo shiva yomim uksiv basukkos teishu shivas yomim. It's not say psukim. So the Ran, if we go back to the lashon of the Ran on Daf Mem Ches, the Ran said the makor of being mechuyev to have and establish a sukkah, in which which will then be one's ikemokum dira for shiva yomim, is learned from the pasuk basukkos teishu shivas yomim. That's all nichla. The she'iltas has the same assumption, the same yisoid as the Ran, that besides carrying out dira in the sukkah, one's mechuyev to establish a sukkah for shivas yomim, but the she'ilta says that the makor for that is a separate gzeres hakasuv. Chag HaSukkah is tasa lecho shivas yomim. What's pashat taich in Chag HaSukkah is tasa lecho? Asiya? Wo steht asiya? The din is dira. Chag HaSukkah is tasa. We learn from that tasa b'lo yimeno osui asiya lishma. But tasa lecho, it's not the she'iltas. Tasa lecho is kipshutai. Before the ikar mitzvah of sukkah, which is to be dor in the sukkah, there's a din to establish a mokum dira for shivas yomim. Zeh steht in she'iltas. We see. We'll see in a moment. We'll be down in the We'll get to the Hemek Shel in a moment. We need it. So now we have a chiddush even further, and that's what you're mentioning. There's a margenisa in a Rashi in Makis on Daf Ches, where Rashi speaks about a shaklavatari of the Gemara of cases in which chativas eitzim, cutting down wood in a yar, when is chativas eitzim a mitzvah or not? So Rashi says that if one is cutting down wood to make a sukkah, that just means to make schach. Zot Rashi, the chativa is not the mitzvah. Asiyas hasukkah mitzvahi. Zot Rashi. Asiyas hasukkah mitzvahi. The Aruch Laner Afanart is medayek that Rashi is mavur that the actual asiyah of the sukkah is a mitzvah. Afanart, the Aruch Laner says, where's the makar? He doesn't bring the she'iltas. He says it's a pasuk mefurish. Chag HaSukkah is tasa lecha. It's a pasuk. Now, it's important to note that Rashi is a much further chiddush than either the Ran or the she'iltas. Why? Because Be'ez Hashem will see as we continue that even if we learn like the Ran and like the Shiltas, and we'll show that Be'ez Hashem and Shittas Rambam, that there's a din to have a sukkah in which one's ikadira is kavua for Shiva Yomim. Is that mitzvah mekuyim? What ma'aseh is necessary? And at what stage is the sukkah established? When is one mekayim that mitzvah of Chag HaSukkos Ta'aseh? It's very possible that, in fact, and we'll show that many Rishonim hold like that the point in which the sukkah becomes the sukkah l'shivas yom is when one begins one's dira in it. When one begins one's dira in the sukkah. Achila Laila Rishona, for example, we'll see the Rogatchover says, but Be'ez Hashem tried to be oimid and other Rishonos of the Rishonim. Correct, when the Kedusha is chalas, we'll see. That is the point in which the Baal HaSukkah has been kaveh, that's his makam dira. Rashi is being mechadish that because there is a mitzvah to have that sukkah as the makam of dirasei kavua for Shiva Yomim, therefore the actual physical construction of the sukkah is already nichlal and has a shem mitzvah. That's an additional chiddush that we see in Rashi. Lepele. Diktuk l'shoinam shal Chazal. The Mishnah in Masechta Nedorim on Daf Tezayin discusses how a neder can be chal to be mevatel as a mitzvah but not a shvu. So the mitzvah says, the Gemara Mishnah says, I can make a koinom on a lulav, koinom lulav shani noito. I'm assuring the lulav that I cannot benefit from it to make a ma'aseh netilah. The lashon in the sukkah is koinom sukkah she'ani oise. Frek the shalmi nedorim me oidi tomesi. Koinom sukkah shani oise. The Gemara says, what koinom is the person making? He's asking the sukkah ba'nod, I won't be yoshev in it. Koinom sukkah shani oise. He's mitzayin that the Ramami Pano in Shuva already asks the kasha. The Ramami Pano says a very shver teretz. He brings from Rabbi Yosef Shol Natan's on. It's mefalpul in the teretz of the Ramami Pano. The Rambam in Hilchas Shavuos in Perek Hey brings that what's the case when neder is chal and shvuah isn't chal, because shvuah is not chal of atlas mitzvah. Zot the Rambam shvuah she'eni oise sukkah. It's a Lashon Rambam mefurish, Lashon Rambam Perek Hey of Hilchas Shavuos. Shvuah she'eni oise sukkah, not she'eni dor. Shvuah she'eni oise sukkah. Lashon Shvuah. And he says that's not chal because shvuah is not chal of atlas mitzvah. He says keitzet kigun shenishba shalayasa sukkah. I think it's the Chikrei Lev that asks the kasha. He says shalayasa sukkah. So let someone else make the sukkah for him. Why is that nishba levatlas mitzvah? We'll see Be'ez Hashem behemshech that the Rogatchover b'toich dvarov kedar kebamish b'ktzara says the reason why the Mishnah says sukkah sheni oise is because the din of mitzvah sukkah is mechayev to establish a sukkah for dira shivas yomim. And he's answering the sukkah b'koinom that the sukkah will not be his mokum dira for shivas yomim. Nimtzo that he wasn't oiseh a sukkah. Zot the Rambam shvuah keitzad nishba shalayasa sukkah. Nishba shalayasa sukkah means I'm not establishing a sukkah for dira shivas yomim. Nifla diktuk l'shainim of the Mishnah. We'll see this, come back to see this Be'ez Hashem behemshech. So we have Shitas Rashi and Makis. We have possibly a Rambam in Hilchas Shavuos that learns the Mishnah in the Dorim's Lashon is Dafka. We also have a Tosfos in Sukkah on Daf Mem Vav. B'Shem Yerushalmi. Tosfos at the top of Daf Mem Vav and Lulav Arava brings a Yerushalmi. Tosfos says, "V'ike toni the toni by Yerushalmi the Perek HaRoya." It's Yerushalmi in Brachas.
Let's put up the Gemara in Mem Vav Amud Aleph.
When a person makes a sukkah, he makes a bracha shekitshonu b'mitzvos v'tzivonu la'asei sukkah. There's a Gemara in Menachos on Daf Mem Beis that Tosfos is taken to. The Gemara in Daf Mem Beis has a shackle of a tarya why we don't make a bracha b'shas asiyas sukkah. Zok the Gemara in Menachos, the reason why we don't is because ein asiyas gemar mitzvah.
According to the Shaitas
of sukkah is kedei, like we said, to be able to have a sukkah to be door in it. And Memela, the Shas Asiyah is not the Shas HaGemar. And on that, the Yerushalmi is Chaylik, and the Yerushalmi says, no, the Shas Asiyah is enough of a Chaylik HaMitzvah that one can be Mevarech. Ba'ofen that Nimtzeinu Lemedim from Tosfos, that there already is a Kiyum Mitzvah in the Shas Asiyah, Lefi the Yerushalmi. So if we're Nochis now Leminyan, to see Mekayris and the Rishonim, for this Yesoid that we want to establish Al Pi the Ran, that besides for the mitzvah of a dira in the sukkah, that maisim of dira have to take place in a sukkah. There's a din that a person has to have b'chlal mitzvah sukkah, a sukkah to be dorin diras kva shivas yomim. We have the Ran, that's why the Mishnah says that one shouldn't be matir sukkah until the end of Shiva. We have the she'iltus of lemevad mitalalta, which the she'iltus says has its own gzeres hakosav of Chag HaSukkos ta'aselecha. We have a Rashi in Makkos Tafches, she'asiyas HaSukkah mitzvah, and the Aruch HaNer says the Makor is Chag HaSukkos ta'aselecha. Well, we'll get to this in a moment, Blineda. We have the Tosfos in Sukkah Daf Memvav. Shitas HaYerushalmi that one's mevorich b'shas asiyas HaSukkah, and the Bavli is only cholet because it's not Gemara mitzvah. And we have the Lashon of the Rambam in Ilchos Shvuos, Keitzad, how is Shvuah not chalavat las mitzvah? Kagon shenishba shelo yasa sukkah. Frek the Shalmi Nadarim shelo yasa sukkah. Frek the Chikrei Leiv sha'achei yasa lo. Shelo yasa sukkah is what the Rogatchover means, not to establish a sukkah that will be my makom kviyas dir.
According to all these shitas, there's a new one of the Taryag mitzvahs called Chag HaSukkah is Taselecha Asiyas HaSukkah.
It's Nichlal. It's Nichlal.
Is that what the Shulta is saying, or it's Nichlal and Yeshiva?
So we're going to get to be mefaret that Beis Hashem Behemshech in more in details. I'm sorry.
Why can you use the Chavar Sukkah?
Yeah, so we'll get to those details Beis Hashem, and we're going to see that this shaila is really discussed first by the Rishonim, the Gabi the dinim of Yitziyah Misukkah l'Sukkah. And I'm not sure we'll get to in this limud Beis Hashem, but in the further limud we'll be near to get to that. Now, as was mentioned before, this beer in the She'iltus is all lulei that Reb Hirsch Leib in Hemek Sheila says differently. And here we'll just mention the Biktarah. It's not not directly negeli in Yonenu, but Reb Hirsch Leib in Hemek Sheila, it's on the right side of the Mar Mekomis, uses the She'iltus to Mechadish Chidush Nifla. And he says that ordinarily, like we're accustomed to understand, the Maisa that prepares the Chayfetz Shel Mitzvah is called Hechsher. Hechsher Ba'alma on the Lashon of Chazal. Zog Reb Hirsch Leib, but where the Torah specifically refers to the preparation of the mitzvah, in that case, the preparation of the mitzvah also has a Shem Maisa mitzvah. It's not just a Hechsher Ba'alma. Not that therefore one's mechuyev to do it. And if Lu Yitzur, one takes a sukkah that someone else prepared, wasn't mevatel a mitzvah. But in the lashon of Reb Hirsch Leib, he says elanir lilmoid milashon Rabbeinu. That 8 lines from the end of the paragraph. The afal gav de ikr mitzvah sukkah hiya yeshiva, v'ha'asiya eino elo hachana. You can see it's the highlighted section in the very bottom of the piece of Hemek Sheila. Says, Mikol mokom yesh ba mitzvah, b'asher hachana zu ksiva b'Torah. Because the Torah specifically described this hachana, v'chashuva mishar hachanas the mitzvahs she'inom ksuvas b'Torah. Ve'enoi doima asiyas sukkah uksivas tefillin u'mezuzas. The ksiva of tefillin and mezuzas is a hechsher mitzvah, but asiyas sukkah is not just a hechsher ba'alma. He says, Ushmiras matzas mitzvahs. An example for that would be Shmiras matzas mitzvah. T'chsivu shmartem es hamatzos v'hachana de Shabbos v'kadoime. Wa'she'en ken zok der agidas lulav v'tikun ha'shoifar, binding the lulav and preparing a shofar to blow. That's a hechsher ba'al. So in Mela Zot the Nitziv, we find that the hachanas that the Torah mentions and hachanas that the Torah doesn't discuss. Where the Torah specifically describes the hachan of the mitzvah, then he says that the asiyah is einoi ela hachana and yesh ba mitzvah. It has a status of mitzvah. But that hachana of the mitzvah is not related according to the Nitziv to yeshiva sukkah or the din of shiva yom. So there's certain instances in which the Torah placed a chashivos, a significance in the preparation of the mitzvah. like Shmiras HaMatzos, Sivas Tefillin and Mezuzahs, Hachana for Shabbos, if it's the Raisa, and so on. So Zot the Netziv, Al Derech Zeh is the Asiyah of the Sukkah. Chag HaSukkah is Ta'asa Lecha. It's a Hechsher. It's not a Kiyum Mitzvah as such. The Torah was Meyachad it, and therefore it has a Shem of a Maisa Mitzvah. And we're suggesting that Lulei Dvarov, Efshe steht in Shiltas Handish. Steht in Shiltas, like the Orchaner learns B'Shittas Rashi from the Pasuk of Chag HaSukkah Ta'asa Lecha, that the actual Asiyah of the Sukkah itself is B'chal Mitzvah Sukkah. If this Yisoid is Be'ez Hashem correct, then let's now try to return to be Miyashiv the Diyukim in the Rambam. The Rambam in Halacha Hey began, Keitzad hi mitzvahs YESHIVAS Sukkah she'oichel b'shoyse v'dor, kol shivas yom adam oises beise arai b'sukkah seikva, she'nemar b'sukkah teish v'shivas yom. Keitzad, kelim hanoim in the Sukkah. Halacha Vov, oichlim b'shoysim v'yeshenim b'sukkah kol shiva, bein b'yom bein b'layla. So we asked that Halacha Hey and Halacha Vov just seem to be a kvelos of each other. Halacha Hey begins, Keitzad hi mitzvah YESHIVAS Sukkah she'oichel b'shoyse v'dor b'sukkah kol shivas yom, bein b'yom bein b'layla. Halacha Vov, oichlim b'shoysim v'yeshenim b'sukkah kol shiva, bein b'yom bein b'layla. It's Hainu Ach. The Fid Vorenu, the Rambam in Halacha Hey and the Rambam in Halacha Vov are two different dinim. The Rambam in Halacha Hey is the Mishnah on Daf Chav Ches. How is a person, like we said from the round, how does a person establish that his sukkah is his makom dira for Shivas Yom? We're first describing the ikr mitzvah of sukkah, which is to have a sukkah l'Shivas Yomim as your makom for dira kvua, which the Ram says is the basic and primary mitzvah of Basukkah's Teishu Shivas Yomim. Zot the Rambam Keitzad hi mitzvahs YESHIVA Basukkah. How are we mekayim the din of Basukkah's Teishu to establish a sukkah for yeshiva for Shivas Yomim? Zot the Rambam, how do we establish that yeshiva Basukkah should be l'Shivas Yomim? By a person being oichel v'shoyse v'dor Basukkah called Shivas Yomim, through the act of achila, shtia, and dira, he has established that this is his makom for dira kvua. We're not speaking about having to be oichel v'shoyse b'sukkah in order to fulfill the din of not being able to be allowed to be oichel or yoshen or shoyse chutz l'sukkah. We're not speaking about being mevatel, the mitzvah of being dor b'sukkah. We're describing how does one establish one's sukkah as one's makom dira. For example, if someone built a sukkah with the best of intentions to be dor in at Shivas Yomim, but in the end he never did, his sukkah was never his makom dira for Shivas Yomim. Just wasn't. And we'll see Be'ez Hashem in a further limud b'nei the lashon of the chinuch is that lu yitzuy someone isn't dor b'sukkah kol Shivas Yomim, he was mevatel the mitzvah of sukkah. We're not speaking about that he missed the achila of Laila Rishayna. The lashon of the chinuch is that lu yitzuy, a person established a sukkah but never was dor in it in any way. He was mevatel mitzvah of sukkah. Not because he was oichel b'shoyse or yoshin outside of sukkah, because his sukkah never became his makom dira. Zot the Rambam, there's one din that yeshiva sukkah is mechayev, like the Ran says, first and foremost, a makom kavua to be dorin. How does one establish it as one's makom kavua? By being done. That's the din that the Rambam says in Halacha. And therefore the Rambam firizois v'kol shivas yom odom oises beisoy arai v'sukkah kva. Nichlal in establishing the sukkah as his diras kva is adrabas to make his bayis arai. How do you make the bayis arai? Remove the kelim from the bayis and put them on the sukkah.
A person can have several houses, so you can have several sukkahs. So you build a sukkah.
And we'll see this in the Rishonim.
And you never walked into the sukkah.
As long as you had one.
But you had to have your foot in one of them.
Foot in one of them. And we'll see this Be'ez Hashem Mefurish B'Hamshich.
Because you have to sleep somewhere.
So you're saying that if you build a sukkah, if you don't take it down, the person has come, gets very sick. And day 6 goes to the hospital, never makes it for all 7 days.
Torah-inus.
He didn't do the mitzvah.
He was an oinus, but he wasn't.
He was a chayla.
There is a much more basic deficiency in his kiyum than just the fact. For example, if it would be possible that if it would be conceivable that he wouldn't have been oichel v'shoyse or done any ma'aseh for Shivas Yomim, which Rishonim describe, that would have been mechayev him sukkah. His shena would always been shena sarai, his achila would always been achila sarai, and his shtia is not a sukkah, is not mechayev sukkah. And you never would have walked into sukkah, so you never would have been mevatel mitzvah sukkah by carrying out a ma'aseh dira outside the sukkah. But if the sukkah was never established as his mokum dira, and we'll see this lashon in the chinuch, it came out that he was never mekayim the most basic thing of basukas teshuv. Now in that case, he's an onus. But the primary chiyuv zot the rana basukas teshuv is lemevad metalalta, to establish a mokum dira for shivas yom. That's one thing. So that is what we're gonna see be'ezer Hashem. That's a nidin in the Achreinim, if bringing the kalim itself, or does one actually have to do some form of achila or shtia, which is considered a ma'aser dira?
That's kasha with bringing the kalim and then going somewhere else, so you have the same.
Should have self-established that din. So now we understand that in halacha hey, the Rambam established the basic din of sukkah shiva, kul shivas yomim, odam oisa sukkah kva and dira and beisay arai. That's a basic din, and therefore that is mechayev that one's achila and shtia should be in the sukkah, not because if one eats outside the sukkah, and so shows outside the one's mevatel mitzvahs essay of dira, because one has to establish the sukkah as one's makam dira. Now in halacha vav, the Rambam discusses a second din. Besides, like the Ran says, that there's a din that one has to have a sukkah shivas yomim, then there's an additional din that any maisa that is characterized as a maisa dira has to then take place in that sukkah. Not in order to confirm and establish that the sukkah is one's makom for diras kva. That one's done already. Let's say by bringing in kalim, by being oichel laila rishona. However, one's established that sukkah is now one's makom kva. But then there's an additional din that any maisa which is characterized as a maisa dira must take place in the sukkah, says the Rambam, and it's also that it should take place outside the sukkah. That's the subject of halacha vav. The subject of halacha vav is oichlin v'shoisim v'yishenim b'sukkah kol shivas yomim ben bayom elala v'osa lechol suda chutz lasukkah v'en yishenim chutz lasukkah. Why? Not because that denigrates the sukkah as one's mokum for diras kva, because there is a specific zeres hakosov that says that because there is a mitzvah's essay of basukas teishvu, anything that is characterized as a ma'aser dira has to take place in the sukkah, and it's also for it to take place outside the sukkah. So nimtzeinu lemedim from the Seder Hadvarim in the Rambam that there are two specific dinim that are nichlal in the Yisod the mitzvah sukkah. The feed around these are all learned from the pasuk of basukas teishu, that one has to have a sukkah established for shiva yomim for kva, and one establishes it for dira by being dor in it. And in addition, Zot the Rambam and halacha vav, now the din of sukkah is also mechayev that anything that's characterized as a ma'aser dira cannot take place outside the sukkah. It's meduyek lahafli. The Rambam only brings the din of osa lechel chutz sukkah or osa lishan chutz sukkah in halacha vav, because in halacha hey we're not discussing that dira has to take place in the sukkah, because dira has to take place in the sukkah, but we're discussing that dira has to take place in the sukkah initially to establish the sukkah as the mokum for one's dira's kva shiva yom. Then the Rambam adds that anything that's characterized as a mokum dira may not take place anywhere else.
How many meals get to
Mm-hmm. So we'll see Be'ezer Hashem that it's correct. So we'll see Be'ezer Hashem that very possibly that to establish the sukkah as the mokum kva, the initial achila b'layla rishona of achilas kva will establish it. And that's what was in reference before, which Be'ez Hashem will get to, and that is that if a person is yeshiv basukkah, it's through his yeshiva basukkah that the Shem Shomayim is chalal sukkah, and the sukkah becomes asa b'hano. And that kipshuto is the first ma'is achila that he does, whenever that may be. And so we'll see Be'ez Hashem behemshech that for the establishment of the sukkah as a makom kva, it would be mechayev and achilas kva. Correct. That's some al-derech.
You were invited out for one day, then you lose the other days that you were living in your house.
What do you mean lose the other days?
You were living in your house. That one day you were invited out, so the whole day you didn't live in
your sukkah.
Yeah.
In your sukkah.
So you lose the whole.
So that will. So this was mentioned before. We'll see Be'ez Hashem that the Rishonim specifically discuss this din of being yoytze mi sukkah l'sukkah, and that's a sugya in of itself. So this is the basic chiddush that we are trying b'siyata d'shmaya to establish, which we're now showing l'chora is oila mitoich the Seder Hadvarim in the Rambam. So to summarize, halacha hey is the establishment of the first din of the sukkah as a makom kavua for dira for shivas yomim, Halacha Vav is that any Ma'aseh Dira must take place in the sukkah. Therefore, the Halacha Hey and Halacha Vav are not repetitious. They're two different mechayvim of Dira in the sukkah. In Halacha Hey, we require an active Dira in the sukkah to establish the sukkah as the Dira's Kva. In Halacha Vav, we're describing that every act of Dira during the Shivas Yomim then has to take place in the sukkah. In Halacha Hey, the Rambam doesn't say Osalecha v'lishan chutz sukkah because we're not describing the mechayiv of Dira taking place in the sukkah. We're mechayiv what the sukkah requires. In Halacha Vav, where we're describing Dira that has to take place, there we mention the lashon of Issa.
There's two mitzvahs.
So this is the Pesach to the sugya, which I'm not sure if time allows us to go into, but this is the Pesach to the sugya of why you can make a shechionu b'shas asiyas HaSukkah. And the shaynis to the Rishonim that somehow the asiyas meshach shaykhet to the kiyum HaSukkah. Yes. Whereas by shofar we don't have that din. Yeah. Correct. That's correct. But the Yisod Advarim is because in the asiyah of the sukkah is not irrespective in some way to the kiyum of the mitzvah. The two things are totally zavazah. So this is the basic hatzor which we want to suggest in the Shittas Rambam. We had a third question on the Rambam, that the Rambam in Halacha Hey doesn't mention Shena, and Halacha Vav he does. And we said that's really a kasha, a very glaring kasha in the Braisa on Daf Chav Ches. The Braisa says, Kol Shivas Yoma da Oisim Sukkah Klav De'eser Arai Oichel V'Shoyse U'Matayel, and it doesn't say anything about Shena. It doesn't say anything about Shena. So here we'll mention briefly a Chiddush Nifla. That's a Mavur B'Toich Dvarov of the Rogatchover, left-hand side of the supplementary Maranakaitis. Zot the Rogatchover Azah. In Hilchas Eruv, for example, in the halachas of Eruvi Chatzeris, the Gemara has a shakla attire in Eruvin if Mokum Pita is Ikir or Mokum Lina is Ikir. What establishes the place of Dira of a person? We know that in Legabi the Dinim of Eruv Chatzeris, where we put the pass is the place of joint Dira for all the Bnei HaChatzer or all the Bnei HaMovim. The Gemara's maskana is Mokum Pita Ikir. The Gemara is madched the tzad that Mokum Lina is Ikir, and the Gemara says Mokum Pita is Ikir, the Mokum Achila. Zot the Rogatchover. If we want to know what establishes the sukkah as the Mokum Kovua for Dira for Shivas Yom, which act would it be? Would it be an act of Shena or an act of Achila? Zot the Rogatchover, since Mokum Pita is the Ikir Mokum Dira, it's a Maisa Achila. Ilam was asking before, what is it that establishes that the sukkah is the Mokum Dira for Shivas Yom? Zot the Rogatchover, it's an act of Achila which establishes the sukkah as the Ikir Mokum Dira. Mimele, in Halacha Hey Zot the Rogatchover, and Kedarka the Rogatchover is very mekatzer, so we're using the Rogatchover al pi darkeinu. In Halacha Hey, where we're describing the Ikr mitzvah of having a sukkah l'shiva yomim, there the Rambam doesn't bring down Shena because Shena doesn't establish the sukkah as a Mokum Kavua. Mokum Pita is the Ikr Mokum Dira of the Adam. Memele the Rambam says, Keitzad mitzvah yeshiva, she oichel v'shoyse b'sukkah. V'shoyse v'dor. Ayadei achila v'shtiya and kelim, he's establishing a Mokum Dira. Mashe ein kein legabi what's osir l'aseh chutz l'sukkah. There, Vibal Shena is also nichlal somewhat in a Ma'aseh Dira. Like Tosfos in Sukkah says that all the Ma'aseh Dira that he does is tofel to the Achila, which means we see the Gemara in Eruvin does say that there is a tzad that Mokum Lina should be a Mokum Dira. Lina also has some aspect of being a Ma'aseh Dira. Memele in Halacha Vav, Zot the Rambam, that when we come to list what Dira has to take place in the sukkah, because taking place outside the sukkah is awesome. There the Rambam mentions Shena, Mamash Nifla.
So if a person comes the first night and takes a nap, that should be enough for Kedusha Sukkah. I mean, Rogatchover maybe not, but according to Shai, you can make a bracha on Shena. A lot of Shai, all places, bracha talks about.
Correct.
Takes a
Correct, but the reason why you can make Shena is because, like Tesis says before in Brachas, it's Nichlal in a more broad Ma'asadira. But if we want to know Zot the Rogachover, we want to be precise, would Shena establish the Sukkah as the Makom Dira for Shiva? Then it wouldn't. That requires a Ma'aseh Achila. Of course, you can make a bracha on it because you can make a bracha according to those Rishonim of just being in the sukkah without sheina or achila. Just being dor in the sukkah allows you to make a bracha, right? Whatever's choshev ma'aseh dira. We're not denying that dira is called that sheina is called the ma'aseh dira. Like we said, the Gemara in Eruvin has it sad that even makam sheina should be a makam dira. Sheina is not irrelevant. It's just makam pita zeker. So in how Chazal established the gedorim of the din deiraisa of what will establish a mokum dira, Zot the Rogachover nifla. The Rambam is medukta. It's dafka mokum achila. If you just see his lashon, we see if you want to see his lashon b'ktzara, he says in the 6th line, he says achine anan kaimelon commando bar eruvin de ikedir shlodem mokum pita. Nimtza kach Zot the Rogachover de b'mashu hu oichel hu oise es HaSukkah l'sukkah. The mitzvah shall sukkah shetie kol zayin keva v'oz nikra shem sukkah. So Kedarka the Rogachover is very mekatzim. He means this is side of the Ran, that the din is to have a sukkah kvua for Shiva, and then Zot the Rogachover there's a separate din ukasheyesh lo sukkah. Once he has a sukkah, oz tzorich leishev sham, then he has to be yoshev. And Mamela he says the gather of sheina chutz la sukkah is an issa to be yoshin chutz la sukkah, but that's not the keva that establishes a sukkah as a sukkah for Shivas Yom. This is the klal advarim which we want to establish b'shittas Rambam, and the Yesod advarim, as we said, has a clear support in the Rogachover, and that will explain. But if a nifla, the difference between halacha hey, which doesn't mention sheina, and the Brais on Daf Chav Chesed doesn't mention sheina, and the halacha vav. Shlomo, how are we for time?
Much more time we have. In terms of how long the roads Agada should be? Is this a natural stop to next time?
Yeah, there's a natural stop to next time, yes.
Okay.
So this is the Yesod Hadvarim, which Be'ezer Hashem, we will be at Maimed in the Rambam. And like we mentioned, Lineder and the Siyata D'Shmai in further Limudim, we'll return to discuss more in detail. That was the number of the Lomdim were asking. What would be the circumstances in which there would have been a bittul of the mitzvahs essay of establishing a sukkah b'shiva yomim, the chinuch which we briefly referenced? We'll discuss the lashon of the Rambam of oser le'echel chutz sukkah, if it's an isser or bittul mitzvahs essay, and then Be'ez Hashem will elaborate to discuss the dinim of shem shamayim chalal sukkah, which was referred to before, and how shem shamayim being chalal sukkah depends on the ma'aseh dira that one does, how one's mekayim in the sukkah, as we'll see Be'ez Hashem in Chidush Reb Chaim Halevi. We had mentioned before the appropriateness and the unique shaykhs between being Chodesh Elul and the mitzvah of sukkah. Sugin Erchin, the Agin Alayim Ki Sukkah, Bitul Hayetzer, is described in Chazal al Pi Mikra as being analogous and being equivalent to sukkah. I want to mention a marganisa, a davar nifla, that's mavur in the Gra. In the Pirush of the Gra al derech HaRemez, in the beginning of Megillas Esther. Cheshbon nifla that the Gra makes. Ayom Mohim, the Psukim say it's unusual to be speaking about Megillas Esther and El, but we'll see it's Mamash Shaychel Adode. Ayom Mohim kisheves hamelech HaChashverosh hakisim al chusei Hashem b'Shushan Abira. Also mishta lechol sorav avodav chel paras umadai. How long was it? Yomim Rabim Shmoinim Uma'asiyam. So again, what's the Indian of Shmoinim Uma'asiyam? So the Gaon says like this. He says, we know that the Shnas HaLevana,
350.
see the lashon of the Gaon, is that the Shnas HaLevana is Shin and Daled Yom. The Shnas HaChama is Oidef Olav to Shin Samechei Yomim and a Revi'ah Yom. Shin Samechei Berevi'ah. Zot the Gaon, the Shnas HaChama, the difference in Shnas HaChama and Shnas HaLevana is that Shnas HaChama is always roimez to the Seder Gashmi that there is in the Bria. Ein kol chodosh tachas HaShemesh. The Shemesh is always the Seder HaGashmi of the Bria. Yom v'layla k'etz v'choyref, The Seder HaGashmi of the Bria is always signified in Mikra by the Shemesh. So Zot the Goin, the Shnas HaShemesh is Shin Samech Yomim Uruvia. He says, Miktzas Hayom Kekuloi, Memele, the length of the Shana is Shin Samech Vov Yomim. Shin Samech Vov Yomim. The Gemara in Shabbos, Daf Peiteh, says that the Osid Lovoi, the Rebbeinu Shalom will bring Klal Yisrael Chas v'Shalom L'Din, and the Avos HaKadoshim will try to be Melamed Sanegoria for Klal Yisrael. Avram will be Melamed Sanegoria, Yaakov will be Melamed Sanegoria. The Gemara says that the Sanegoria that will be Megan, that will be the defense of Klal Yisrael, is the Sanegoria of Yitzchak Avinu. What's he going to say? One of the things he's going to say is that for half the time, Klal Yisrael wasn't Chayte B'chlal. What's that half? The Palga D'Leiliyah. Palga D'Leiliyah, when a person's not active, he wasn't Chayte in that time. Palga D'Leiliyah.
When we're sleeping.
Zot the Goin. The Shana is Shin Samech Vav Yomim. Half of that, remove. It's Kuf Pei Gimel. It's Kuf Pei Gimel. Zok the Goin, the Shnas HaChama we said is a remes to the Koiches HaGashmi that are on the Bria. He says it's a remes to all the Koyach HaTaiva, all the Koyach of Meshicha to Dvarim Gashmi, all the Koyach to the Meshicha to Taiva and Chenda that the Adam has, is for Kuf Pei Gimel Yom. Zok the Goin Mishtem Meo V'Shmoinim Muma'as Yoim is because there are 3 Yomim in the Shana that the Adam isn't subject to that same Meshicha Gashmis that he's subject the whole year. What are those 3 Yomim? So the Lashon of the Goin is Gimel Mehem Hem Rosh Chodesh Elul Rosh Hashanah V'Yom Kippur Shehem Yomim Rabim Shem Yimei Tsar LeYetzahara Nimtza Shmoinim Uma'asiyah. Zot the Goin a mensch can praven mishte only 180 days a year. There are 3 yomim that the Rebbeinu Shalom created such a metzias in the Bria that the person becomes a little bit separated, a little bit less nimshach, a little bit refined. He's already not tachas Hashemesh anymore. He's not tachas the Meshicha to be mishte. Memele it's meduktek shmoinim u'ma'asiyim. Zot the Goin Oisher kvoid malchuso yikar tiferes gedulosoi. All the praverai that comes machmas the odom's chenda and taiva and cover is only shmoinim u'ma'asiyim in the sham. Palgas leiliyah left kuf pei gimel yomim. Zot the Goin is yimei tsar layetze. Those yomim are Chodesh Elul, Rosh Hashanah, v'Yom Kippur. Fragt sich the Shaila that l'chayra it should be 40 yomim. Harei El starts Arboim Yimei Ratzon, which go from El until all through to Yom Kippurim. Weiß dich ois en chenami. Avada in all the 40 yomim, these are yom of Eis Ratzon. But in which yomim do we find b'miyuchad that there's a hispirus that a person can release himself a little bit from being under the shlita of the tachas hashemesh, from under being drawn and dragged to Mishnah? One of those yom is Rosh Hashanah, one of those yom is Yom Kippurim, and the other is Rosh Chodesh El. B'yom Rosh Chodesh El maskilim litkaya. There's a significance in Rosh Chodesh El, in the tchila of Chodesh El. There's a goyin in Yoina, that the goyin says that Yoina was mahalech gimel yomim in Ninveh. He said, Oid shloisha yomim Ninveh ne'epoches. Zot the goyin, what are those shloisha yomim? Rosh Chodesh Elul, Rosh Hashanah, and Yom Kippur. It's a remez. There are 3 yomim which we can grab, which we can use, because then there's this oirus milamala that allows the person to zich dahoiben in abyssal. That there's no longer shayla to him, yikar tiferes gedulasai, oisher kvoid malchusai, mishta, it's all left. It's all abandoned. Because on those gimel yomim, the goyin is yemei tsar liyetzar. Those are yomim which the koyach of the yetzer is weakened. The rest of Elul is a hemshech of the rosh of the chodesh. In the Rosh of the Chodesh lies, the Zman that Moshe was Oila Lamorim, but Taku Bashayfa. Like the Torah says, Kedei, that they shouldn't be toyeh to be nimshach after the Tos HaYetzer that caused Chet HaEgel in the first place. What's mavur from the Gra is that's a remez. What does it mean that then we have a remez that the shofar was tekeh and therefore we're no longer as at risk to be nimshach after the Tos of the Yetzer? It's advised that in the Avodah Sa'odom al Yidei the Hayitoka Shofar Be'ir V'Omle Yechrodu on Rosh Chodesh Elul, we can release ourselves from that blinding draw of Mishnah Oisha Kved Malchusa Yikar Teferes Kedosa. It's only Shmoinim U'Ma'as Yoim that the Odom is Tachas Ha'anhag of the Shemesh. But in those 3 Yomim, a person can release himself. There's a release, a weakening. You made Tzar L'Yetzer. It's kedai just to add one more prat, and on this base Hashem will finish. There's a mevucha in the poskim that if we require our boy Yimei Ratzon, then kefi the kviyas of our luach elul is chaser. So we should actually start kiyas shofar on Lamed Av. Biragra in Shulchan Aruch it says that he balt in the Kvius that was Bamidbar, Elul was Mali. Therefore, the Arboim Yom began on Aleph Elul, not on Lamed Av. And El L'Deiros, it was always Nikva that we begin the Tekiah on Aleph Elul. Hagam, that Lefi the Cheshvan of our Luach, if we want Arboim Yom, we should start a day earlier. Let's move on to the Aragot. We're going to run discuss the Shaila.
We start on Chaft.
We should start on the last day of that, yeah. So. Yeah, so the guy establishes Al Pi Midrashim that that Shana that they were Kiriyat as Moli. I mean, maybe that's how they had the cheshbon of the Arboim. Yeah, in Nechanami, but the klal is always is El Kedim Rosh Hashanah Leilam Chassid. The Gemara says in that's the klal, and our kviyas is certainly like that. Lefid Vorenu. Perhaps the reason why is because we require the Yom of Aleph Elul itself. Besides our Boim Yom of Rachmim, which we have, the Koyach of the Yemei Elul lies in Rosh Chodesh Elul itself. It lies in that Yom that they were Tekeach Kadesh Lo Yitu Achar Yetzer. The Utzma, the Koyach, the Shoirish of Chodesh Elul lies in Aleph Elul, because in Aleph Elul is the Yom Tzar Yetzer. Aleph Elul is not just accumulation of our Boim Yomim of Rotzen and Tkiya during the Yemei Elul. It's because our Boim Yomim, the Yomim of Elul have at their Rosh, and what initiates them and begins them, Zot L'Goyin, is a Yom Tzar Yetzer. It's one of the Gimel Yomim in which the Yetzer is not Shailet. And therefore it's on that Yom that we begin the Avodah of Elul, where we release just a little from like what the Lashon of the Gemara in Erevin, Kuli Alma Kibei Hilula Damya. Our whole mahalach in Olam Hazeh is Mishnah. As I state with Lashon of the Gemara in Erevin. Alma Kibei Hilula Damya. Chatoy ve'echol, chatoy ve'shteh. It's our choice. We can either have Mishnah of Yikar Teferes and Gedula, and the Mishnah, or the Mishnah of Chatoy ve'echol. What gives us a koyach to redirect that the Mishnah should be the Mishnah of Toiv Leiv Mishnah Tamid, the Mishnah of Avodah, the Mishnah of Dvash v'chol of Tachas l'shenecha. So we have a matana of Gimel Yomim Bashana. It's only Shmoyin Mimas Yoyim. It's not Kuf Pei Gimel Yomim, because in the Rosh Chodesh Elul lies the Sheirish of Yimei Tzar L'Yetzer, that we can release ourselves from that. And Be'ez Hashem to be Mekayim Chatoy ve'echol, Chatoy ve'shteh, which will bring us l'Sefer Arboim to Ksiba Chasimah.
Okay, Rabbi Sai, we will reconvene the